I'm James Rule. Welcome to the Lonely Leader podcast, where we help existing and aspiring leaders find clarity, build resilience, drive performance, and enhance fulfillment. Dealing with negative people. That's the focus of today's episode. And a particular thank you to Danny, one of our listeners, who dropped me a line on LinkedIn and asked for some help and support with this specific issue in mind. Now, the points I'm going to share might sound straightforward, but as with everything we talk about, question and reflect on, well, are you implementing all of them? Point number one, limit exposure. I know that sounds very, very obvious, but one of the best ways to deal with negative people is to limit your exposure to them. Now, this transcends our professional role and our personal lives, but I appreciate it is far harder from a professional role situation to limit exposure. You cannot always control who you work with, but in our personal lives, it is far easier to control who we socialize, for instance. Not, on the flip side of that argument, easy to always control interactions with extended family members. That being said, the first thing to consider is, can you limit exposure? I've talked in previous episodes about the difference between energy drainers and energy boosters. Energy boosters are those people that want the best for us, that build us up, that make us feel great when we're around them and empower our mindset. And the drainers are obviously the reverse. They always seem to have a problem for every solution. They're negative. They're drainers. Now, as I've said in that previous episode, I am not advocating abandoning a friend or colleague in need. Everybody has moments of crisis where they need people to rally around them and support them. But if somebody is consistently, week in, month out, year out, a negative energy drainer, then you need to start thinking about, how do I limit my exposure to this individual? Stay calm, stay composed. I often think that the lessons we learn as a parent are hand and glove aligned with what we need as leaders. So for those of you that are blessed to be parents, you will know that when you're faced with negativity, a tantrum, some sort of meltdown, meeting that with anger and frustration has zero impact on your child. In fact, it just inflames the situation. And I think that's exactly the same in our leadership capacity. If you have a member of your team that is displaying negative traits and you meet that with frustration, anger, irritation, you are just going to escalate. You are just going to fan the flames and you are going to find that things get worse before they get better. So I think the first step is to remain calm and composed and allow them to express themselves and express that frustration. Sometimes they just need to get things off their chest, and that in itself creates a form of closure and brings an end to the negative behavior. Set boundaries. Now, in the previous point, I talked about the need to be calm and composed, but that doesn't mean that you should tolerate or accept aggressive, abusive, or any other form of overtly negative behavior. I think it's important for your own mental health and well-being that you establish boundaries, and when the initial storm has passed, as we've said, staying calm and composed and allow that frustration to be expressed, but to then be able to revisit that with the particular team member and articulate what is and isn't acceptable and what you are and are not willing to accept in the future when they have levels of frustration. There's a respectful way to express it, and equally, there is a disrespectful way that is going to be very draining on your well-being if you are exposed to that regularly. So I think it's important to establish those boundaries and make people aware of how we're going to deal with frustrations in the future. Practice empathy. This is the fourth point I want to consider. And with all of us, when there is a negative form of behavior, it's important to establish what the root cause is, and it's not always immediately apparent. So, in my experience as a CEO, you may see elements of behavior that challenge you and you want to react to. But when I've explored them further, it was because something invariably was happening in their home life. That might have been their partner or their child was sick. It may have been some sort of situation their teenager had fallen into, or some sort of financial pressure. But invariably, those personal situations were exacerbating their negative behavior. And by showing empathy, compassion, understanding for what they were going through, perhaps giving them a little bit of time away from work to deal with it, it immediately removed the negative behavior. So I think it's really important to always step back, ties in well with remaining calm and composed, and try and establish what is the root cause of this behavior. And is there anything I can do as the leader to support my colleague through this, to remove this negative behavior, but more importantly, remove the root cause to prevent any future occurrence of negative behavior that's related to this root cause. The next point to remember is don't take it personally. As we've just alluded to in the previous point, invariably there is some underlying reason for negative behavior. It's very easy for our ego to dominate these situations and to build a narrative that this individual has a problem with us or our strategy or what we're asking them to do. And we turn it into something very personal. When in actual fact, that might be the case, but invariably it's not. So it's important to put our ego to one side, to not take things personally, which aligns with us then finding it far easier to be genuinely empathetic, which then ties back in to it becoming far easier to remain calm and composed. So all of these points interlink, but all too often I see leaders taking personal offense at certain behaviors because they think it's a reflection on them that these sort of things are taking place, and it's a challenge of their authority or their ideas or their strategy, and therefore they react from a position of defending that ego rather than moving into empathy and remaining calm and composed. Focus on solutions, not problems. This ties in very much with the themes of communication that I touch on regularly on this podcast, but particularly with those clients I coach and mentor. I always encourage people to move quickly from identifying the problem to talking about the solution. I'm sure you've been in those meetings where one individual or a handful of individuals take up all of the oxygen and spend the allocated amount of time going over and over the problems, the challenges, the adversity, and it becomes, for want of a better word, one big whinge. And there's very little substantive strategy or action taken because most of the meeting was consumed by people ranting about the problem. So for me, it's obviously critical to be able to identify what the problem is. Of course, that goes without saying. We're not mind readers. We need to be able to identify and establish what the problem is. But I think it is imperative as the leader that you are able to then change gear and to put a line in the sand and say, okay, we understand the problem. What are we going to do about it? What can we control? And when people drift into talking about other issues and other challenges that fall onto the out of our control basket, we have to park that and say, we can't control that. Bring it back to what can we control? We have a problem, we have a challenge. What can we do about it? And I think that very quickly changes the dynamic of a meeting. It changes the atmosphere and a mood, and it forces us to move away from negativity into solution orientated discussions, which invariably has a much more positive feel and vibe about it. So when you're in a meeting, whether you are leading it or not, if you feel that it's spiraling out of control and it's just a one long rant of negativity, shift gears, ask that question. We all understand what the problem is now, but what can we do about it? And that will create a dramatic shift and change from negativity to positivity. And whilst we're on the subject of positivity, the next tip is maintain a positive attitude. I am a huge believer that positivity is contagious and negativity is equally contagious. I think the leader is the thermostat of an organization. Reflect on the good and bad leaders you've worked with. If there's a problem and the leader's panicking and is stressed and behavior is changing as a consequence, they become short, abrasive, or aggressive, does that create a calm and positive environment? No. Other people become panicky. Other people become short and abrupt. Other people start displaying aggressive or abrupt behavior. And the opposite is also true. When you have a leader that is predominantly positive, that is always solution orientated, that is looking for the best in everything, then that ripples out and permeates through the organization. And it's almost like a fire extinguisher for me. When there's a negativity burning and somebody always brings positivity, eventually it extinguishes that flame. So if you can always bring that positive outlook, bring people back to a mindset of, okay, understood, but what's the solution? You gradually start to reduce those episodes of truly overtly negative behavior. Yes, people have frustrations, but what we're talking about here is those overt displays of negativity that ripple out and start to corrode the culture in organizations. You want that stopping. You want it stopping at source, and being a relentlessly positive leader will be integral in doing that. The next point is consider professional help. Now, you have a judgment call to make here. The behavior you see could be very out of character. It could be an isolated incident, or it could be a theme that's been developing, but when you've shown empathy and you've really explored the situation with the individual, you've identified some reason, the root cause, a trigger, something going on in their home life that with the right attention and focus can be addressed and the negative behavior will be dissipated. But sometimes there can be a deeper seated underlying issue that isn't as easy to address. It doesn't happen frequently, but it can happen. And in those situations, I think it's imperative that you encourage the individual to seek some level of professional support. Now, that on a softer level may be some element of coaching or mentoring, but it might need something from a more clinical perspective. So it's not to be too alarmist, but there is a chance that people might have some sort of deep-seated mental health issue that is creating these negative behaviors. And the last thing we want is them suffering in silence. So encouraging them and supporting them to get some additional professional guidance and support is morally an obligation of every leader, I believe. Last but not least, seek support. In this instance, I'm talking about you as the leader. It's very easy to be so focused on your team needs. You're building empathy. You're being calm and composed. You're identifying challenges at home. You're helping them address it. You're giving people time off to deal with that. You're looking at bringing in additional support if there's a deeper seated mental health issue. You're bringing a relentless positivity to a situation. You're ensuring the discussion always moves to solutions. But there is a element where you only have so much bandwidth. And if you're exposed to a lot of negativity, I think it's important that as a leader, you have somewhere to release the pressure valve yourself. Now, that might be talking things through with your partner. Equally, it could be a colleague, your boss. It could be a coach or a mentor. But I think it's good on several levels. First of all, you just need to get things off your chest sometimes. And a problem shared is a problem halved, rather than retaining that level of pressure and frustration internally, which can compromise your performance or mental health. I think, secondly, it allows you to strength test how you're handling things. When you can talk to somebody in confidence about this is the situation I'm encountering, this is how I'm dealing with it, you get a perspective. Perhaps they have an insight that you haven't considered that you can bring to the fore to resolve the situation. Perhaps they think you're being overtly lenient or overtly harsh around a particular situation. But that sense of perspective is important to allow you to sense check what you're doing and revisit that particular issue. So just because you're the leader, you're not expected to have the answer and solution to every single problem that you encounter. And that includes the exceptionally challenging element of man managing. Your team, particularly as those teams grow, is complex. And to get the best out of them, you really need to be on your toes and bringing the very best of yourself as a leader. And therefore, it makes sense to have somebody who can support you, who can assess what you're doing independently, that's a little bit separated from the situation, not as emotionally involved. And I think that's a wise investment in you as a leader to make sure you have that person somewhere in your ecosystem. Negative people, we're going to encounter them. We're going to encounter them at work particularly. We spend a huge amount of our time at work, but I hope these points have given you a bit of a roadmap so that when negative behavior surfaces, we look at it as a behavior rather than the person. That's the key differential, I think, to finish on, that people are not inherently negative. It's their behavior that's negative. What can we do to address and alter that behavior? It'll make their life easier. It'll make their level of fulfillment all the better. And it will certainly make your life and fulfillment so much better as their leader. Thanks for listening to the Lonely Leader podcast. I'd be very grateful if you could share and follow if the content resonates. And if you're looking for additional free resource to support your continued growth and development, then please do check out our social media and website details in the show notes. Remember, quality leadership on the outside must always start within.